Hello and welcome to Folktales and Fantasy, the podcast where we talk about all things fantasy and more. My name is Cameron Michaels, and welcome to episode 5, but the second episode of us going through and talking about trilogies. And so, just like last episode, we are talking about the Emaneska series by Bengali, which is technically 4 books, but the last episode of this, we're going to talk about the last 2 books at once because they were originally planned to be 1 book. And we are talking also about The Lord of the Rings, which I listened to unabridged and narrated by Rob Inglis. I will be talking about the book and the adaptation. But first, we are going to just jump right into this and talk about the Emaneska series, specifically Book 2, Pale Kings. And while originally, last episode, I said I wasn't sure whether the first book, The Written, or Pale Kings was my favorite, I feel pretty certain now, after really reflecting on it a lot this past week, Pale Kings is my favorite book in this series so far. I am currently reading The Forever King, which is book 1 of the Skalason Chronicles, which is the first book in a sequel trilogy that takes place around 25-ish years after the Emaneska series. And I've been quite enjoying that, but Pale Kings is still my favorite so far. And I think the reason for that is the themes behind this entire series that Bengali is writing. And I am not sure if this is the theme that he intentionally wanted the reader to get out of it, but this is a theme that I see throughout these books that really starts to take shape here in this book, and that is consequences. And I know in the last episode, I ragged a lot on the book. I love The Written, the first book. I love the Emaneska series quite a bit. It's the series that got me back into reading fantasy and just reading in general, just back into literature other than writing. And even in many ways, it influenced my writing heavily. And I think that might be the reason why I feel so comfortable criticizing this series. That's maybe a big reason for why last episode I ragged more on The Written than I did praising it, I feel. And I honestly just feel comfortable stating its flaws simply because it is my favorite. I don't know if that makes sense, but this series just means a lot to me. I know it's not for everyone, so I feel like I have to acknowledge that. But now we get to the point where I was in it for the long haul. This is the point where I was like, yeah, I'm reading this to the end. I will not stop until I've seen the conclusion to this series. And I'm still dedicated to that. When Bengali finishes the Skalason Chronicles, I'll be there buying his books when they release. And I'll be reading them and waiting to see what the conclusion is. And that's because the point that I have grasped from these books is the idea of someone making decisions and there being repercussions for every single decision and choice made. And often when we think of consequences for our actions, usually we assume that is consequences for bad decisions. And most of the time, granted, that is the case, but not always. That's not always how it ends up being. Sometimes we choose something that we know to be is right, and the consequences for us making that choice are difficult for us to grasp. Heck, that's even a core theme in the novel that I'm in that I am currently having edited and revising is that any path that is truly right is a struggle. It's hard. Making the right choice has just as many ramifications as a negative choice can be. And that's why it's so hard to make the right choice, because it's like, what's the point? What's the point of making the right decision if I'm still going to get punished for that? Maybe punished isn't the right word, but there's going to be ramifications. There's always ramifications for everything. With every action, there's an opposing reaction. And that can't be more clearly stated in Pale Kings, because there is a specific decision that this book focuses on that is clearly a negative choice made by Farden, the main character, in the first book. And in the second book, we see how large this choice expands, how bad it is, how truly consequential that single decision made for not just those around him, but for Emaneska. The entire world is affected by this one small negative choice that Farden makes in one brief moment in the first book, and this second book, Pale Kings, is just the start of it. This is just the beginning. The rest of the series is Farden's redemption arc. Really, his redemption arc starts in book 3, and even especially in book 4, when things start to take an even further down spiral. But it all begins here. You see all of the complexity. I praised the written last episode for being so simplistic, yet having such complex world building. In this one, that is not the case. This is not a simple plot. It's not difficult to follow per se, but the plot gets a lot more political and a lot more complex is really the only word I can think of. So help me for being repetitive, but the plot becomes more complex. It expands. It expands in a organic way. It could never have stayed as that simplistic plot of a stolen spellbook. With the way the first book ends, it clearly sets up for what is coming. That one decision made in the book, which I didn't like reading at all, it comes to fruition here. And this is just the start of it. And the world building is expanded on hugely in this book. We learn so much about Emaneska in this book. It's insanity. I will say, though, those who do not like info dumps, I know info dumps are a bit of a controversial mixed bag for readers. I've heard that if you like Robert Jordan and The Wheel of Time, then info dumps, especially if there's an effort to weave them into the text, is more accepted, but not everyone's going to like that. That is what this book does. There are info dumps, and there's one in particular that I'm specifically thinking of that is in this book that just explains almost everything there is to know about this world. Just goes into extreme detail about it. And I just remember I couldn't pull away from it. I remember I read this book on a camping trip with my mom and my 2 younger sisters. We went up to Big Lake, and it was that was so fun. But the things I remember about that trip is writing and reading Pale Kings. And I specifically remember reading this part specifically at night with a nightlight while everyone else was either watching Heartland or sleeping. It might have been both for how long I was reading. And I just couldn't pull away, because not only is the world building properly incorporated into the story. It makes sense that that is there. But it's just so fascinating. There's nothing vanilla about this world. It is so intriguing, and learning about it for the first time, it never goes into as much detail in any of the other books as it does here as far as my recollection goes. And I love it. I love it so much. I love it so much I could read it again right now. But I won't, because I'm reading The Forever King, and also reading The Wheel of Time, and also reading The Poppy War, and also reading Lightbringer. I'm reading so much right now, but it's a good problem to have. I want to talk about some of the other characters in these stories, because I really only touched on Farden last episode and didn't talk about any of the other characters, so I am sorry about that, but I'm going to talk about some of the other characters now. Durnus is probably my favorite character in the entire series. Him or Farden, but Durnus might be my favorite in the whole series, and that includes the Skallison Chronicles. I love him as a character. He is a vampire with a mysterious past, and he's just so he's like the closest thing to the Gandalf character in these books, and it's such an interesting twist on the mentor character. Like, he is, now I think about it, oh my gosh, he is the mentor character. He is the closest thing to Gandalf that we see in this story. You know, most fantasy novels have a mentor character, or at least a lot do, and that is what Durnus is, and he's a vampire. Like, that's awesome. Like, there are werewolves and vampires. There's, like, every fantasy creature you can think of is probably in here. And if you read the first few books and you're like, oh, this one creature that I know about didn't make an appearance, it'll probably make an appearance in one of the next few books. That's just how it happens, and I love it. I love the creativity of just being like, well, there's no real restrictions. I can do what I want. I'm just gonna put them all in. And again, it just makes this world feel lived in. I love it. I love it. There are werewolves. They're called lycans in these books. But Durnus is such a cool character. He's already interesting and is awesome in every fight scene he's in the first book, but in the second book, he gets some interesting character development. Some character development that I honestly didn't see coming. It's a plot point that is really integral to the story, and again, he makes some decisions that will have ramifications in the future, things he has to learn to work around. Granted, not as put into the spotlight as Farden's decisions, but still intriguing, and Durnus is just so cool. I don't know what it is about him, he's just so cool. I love him. There is one character, though, that kind of grates me, and that's Alessi. Is that how you say her name? Alessi? She's this maid who just has the biggest crush on Farden. She's in love with Farden, and he's just oblivious as ever, and that starts to have development, and she starts to make some decisions in the second book that, again, have ramifications, both positive choices and negative choices made, and they both have ramifications, and I love that, but her character just kind of bothers me at times. This is probably, in Pale Kings, this is probably where I got the most annoyed with her. And granted, I could see some people actually quite liking her character, but I just thought she was a little bit annoying. But granted, she does get better in the series as the series goes. In The Forever King, she's become like almost a mentor character, which I just love. I love seeing where characters end up in these stories. And now being on the outside looking in, I love it. I love reflecting on the stuff I've read after I've read it. Like, I started reading these books early last year, I want to say, and just spent the whole year going through the Emaneska series, and it was a joy to read, and this one was definitely the highlight. There are some other characters that I could talk about in this book specifically, but that would go too far into spoilers. There are literal characters that I am not able to talk about that are some of the most intriguing characters, and I can't talk about it because spoilers. So I'll just end it here by saying Pale Kings, by far the best Emaneska book thus far, in my opinion. We'll see what my opinion of The Forever King is once I've finished reading it. And yeah, go read the Emaneska series if you want to. Again, it is grim dark or dark fantasy, so if that's not your thing, you probably won't enjoy this, but if you're up for it, give it a try. Give it a try. All right. Now we're going to talk about The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien, narrated by Robert Inglis, and the film adaptation. And this is where things get a bit more interesting as far as comparing the two. The first two, as I said, I liked the adaptation a bit more than the book. The Two Towers and The Return of the King are tough for me. I'm not entirely sure which one I like more. And I'll get more into that when we get into Return of the King, but right now we're talking about The Two Towers. Full disclosure, unlike the Emaneska books, because I know a lot of people haven't read those, I am going into full spoilers for both the book and the adaptation, the movies of The Lord of the Rings. I will be going into full spoilers for all things Lord of the Rings, so if you haven't watched the movies or read the books somehow, then just don't listen to me, or if you don't care, then just listen to this anyway. I'm going into spoilers, okay? I'm going into spoilers. I loved The Two Towers way more than The Fellowship of the Ring. It wasn't even close, honestly. And I don't know, the pace of it all just felt more cohesive. There felt like there was a bit of a slog in the first section, the first half of The Fellowship of the Ring, and I never really got that here with The Two Towers. If you don't know, each book is split in half in 2 books. So in total there are 6 books, and the Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King serve as almost volumes. So the Fellowship of the Ring has book 1 and book 2. Two Towers, book 3 and book 4, and so on. The Two Towers, each book mainly focuses on, in The Two Towers especially, almost primarily focuses on a specific group of characters. It's not like in the movie where it jumps back and forth. Let me give an example. In The Two Towers, in the movies, it will show a little bit of what Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas, what they're doing with finding Merry and Pippin, and then it'll cut to Merry and Pippin. What are they doing? What's going on with them? And then it'll cut to Frodo and Sam. What's going on with Frodo and Sam? And it makes it more cohesive for a movie experience. Not like that in the book. The books are a way different type of media, and I think the way it's done in the books is done well. There is book 1 and book 2. Book 1, I believe, is specifically dedicated to the Fellowship. So Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Merry, and Pippin. And I think even Merry and Pippin and Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, those 2 groups are even split pretty separately from each other for the majority of this first book, and then the second book is just all Frodo and Sam. It's just only Frodo and Sam. And honestly, that might bother some people, but for me, I loved it because the Fellowship of the Ring ended with Frodo and Sam leaving, and immediately I was like, well, what happened to Aragorn? What happened to the rest of the Fellowship? And the first book is like, okay, you want to know what happened to the Fellowship? Here's everything that's going on with the rest of the Fellowship. Here's what they're doing. Here's the Battle of, Helm's Deep. Here is the Battle of Isengard with Treebeard and the Ents, which is all awesome, by the way. And then, once I get all of that, I start to wonder, well, we've done all of that. We've seen Helm's Deep. We've seen the Battle of Isengard. What's happening with Frodo and Sam? What are they doing now? Are they getting near to Mordor? Are they meeting up with Gollum yet? And it says, oh, you want to see Frodo and Sam? Let's show you all of the things they've been doing at the same time as what you just previously read. And I love it. I loved it so much. Oh my gosh. I love that it did it this way because it just feels fresh. Despite this being such an old book, it feels unique because a lot of books, arguably rightfully so, because it's just easier to do with modern fantasy, it just felt fresh to me, focusing on a specific group of characters for the first half, and then focusing on the other group of characters for the second half. It just worked for me, and it might not work for everyone, but it certainly did with me. I already talked about Tolkien's world building. I've gone to great lengths talking about it when I talked about The Hobbit and the Fellowship of the Ring, and that is all present here. And I would say even more focused up. There's no Tom Bombadil moment. Again, I liked the stuff with Tom Bombadil, but I feel like it slogged on for a little bit too long. It feels all focused in here. And I was even more enraptured by it than I was in the Fellowship of the Ring. But comparing the two, comparing this to the movie, there is some stuff like, the changes between the books and the movies start to show their faces here. And the first one that is of note is the battle for Isengard with Saruman and the Ents and Merry and Pippin. In the movie, the discussion with the Ents and Merry and Pippin on whether or not the Ents will go to war against Saruman and Isengard is spread out through the entire movie. Not so in the book. As I said, the first half of The Two Towers, the first book, if you will, focuses all on the remaining Fellowship minus Frodo and Sam. And that includes the Battle of Isengard and Helm's Deep, unlike in the movie where it all ties itself together at the end of the movie. That all comes to a close around the end of this book, and even goes a little bit further. This book goes a bit further than the movie does. The movie ends with the Battle of Isengard and Helm's Deep, and Frodo and Sam get released from Faramir and are heading towards Minas Mogul. I hope I said that right. And they're going towards the tunnel where Shelob's lair is. In the book, it ends with Frodo getting stung by Shelob. Sam battles the spider, which in the movies is in like near the halfway point of the Return of the King film. So it goes way further. Sam battles the giant spider, defeats it, thinks Frodo is dead, takes the ring, becomes a ring bearer for a little bit. Frodo is taken by the orcs up to a tower in Mordor. Sam realizes Frodo is alive and goes after him. That is where the Two Towers book ends, and that is not at all where the movies end. And that is primarily because the ending of Return of the King is much longer in the books than it is in the movies, but we'll save that for the next episode. But that is a change. That is a big major change, that the end of the book is not where the movies end. The same events happen slightly differently, but the same events basically happen. And the movies, I think, adapted this very well and made well on fitting in the ending of Return of the King. And again, we'll talk about that next episode. But it makes sense. These are something that Peter Jackson understands, or the other people working behind this movie, they understand the differences in media. The books can do it this way. The way that it was done here in the books, I don't think would have worked in movie format. The way it is in the movies is done perfectly. It all flows together so well. These are some of the most highly regarded movies. Why? Because not only do they respect the source material, but they know what and when things should be changed in order to make the movie-going experience better. They're not just fans of the book. They know what it is. They know what it means to make a good film. And arguably, I don't even know what it means to make a good film. I've never made a good film, but these people clearly do. They make the right calls, and they set up when the events should end and when they shouldn't, to where it has a satisfying conclusion when the third one comes out. And it works, just like it works in the way they do it in the books, the way Tolkien did it in the books, the way he wrote it. It works both ways. But a big change that I noticed is, in the book, Treebeard is not hesitant to go up against Isengard. It's actually quite the opposite. He's like, yeah, we need to take down Isengard. It's not like in the movies where he has to be shown that all of these trees are dead and then he gets pissed and is like, all right, let's do this. Let's go to our deaths. Let's go take down this stupid white wizard and kick his butt. Like, it's not like that. He is very much the instigator to the other Ents, like, hey, we gotta do this. We gotta go to war. This Saruman has turned on us. He needs to be put down. And there's no hesitance with the other Ents. The other Ents are just like, yeah, let's do it. It does take a long time for them to say things like it does in the book, in the movie, but it's not as indecisive. And also, the stuff with Faramir is not nearly as hostile as it is in the film. I do honestly prefer, if I'm honest, I honestly prefer Faramir, it showing the conflict between whether Faramir should take the ring or not. And at the end, he ultimately does make the same choice that he does in the book. He lets Frodo go, but he feels conflicted. It feels human. I've had discussions with people who have said that because he initially is conflicted about this, that he's no longer the heroic character that he's supposed to be in the book, and I disagree. I wholeheartedly disagree. Respect your opinion. Everyone can have their own opinions. Opinions are subjective. It's a form of media. But I prefer the way the movie did this because it is still ultimately his decision whether or not Frodo and Sam and Gollum go. It is his choice. And his guy who's serving under him says, if you let them go, your life is forfeit. And Faramir says, then it is forfeit. Release them. That's not in the books. And that moment right there still proves that Faramir is still just as heroic as Sam says in the extended edition. If you're going to watch these movies, watch the extended editions. He says, you are of the highest honor. What you have done today is truly heroic. That's a saying from the book. Not exactly what I said. I'm paraphrasing here. But Sam makes that same comment in the book. Why is it in both forms? Because both are shown heroism. There's just a little bit more humanity and conflict in Faramir initially, but he ends up making the right choice. It's with more hesitancy, but I think what Peter Jackson is trying to do is flesh out his character more. And I appreciate that. I do. I appreciate that. If I had to pick whether either the book or the movie, I'm honestly not sure which one I would pick. I've gotten to the point where I don't think I can decide anymore. It's not like with the movie where I'm like, oh yeah, I could easily pick the movie over the book. With this one, each one gives me a different feeling. They have the same tones. They still have the same dark tones. But I just want to have them both. They're both so good. But I suppose I would choose the book. I guess. I think I would choose the book, maybe. I don't know. I might change my mind later. I don't know. I don't know. And I don't think it matters. I love them both. They're both excellent. As far as the movie, I prefer the Two Towers movie over the Fellowship of the Ring movie, so both the movie and the Book of the Two Towers I feel are better than the first one, so there's no dispute there. But one more thing I want to talk about before we end this, before we stop talking about the Two Towers, is the Battle of Helm's Deep. I want to talk about the Battle of Helm's Deep because I was shocked at how much I loved the entire Battle of Helm's Deep in the book. I adored it. I absolutely loved it. It was not my favorite. It is not my favorite action sequence in these books. That goes to a scene in The Return of the King. But it is definitely up there with some of my favorite action sequences in all of fantasy. And I don't say that lightly. There are a lot of fantasy scenes, especially from the Emaneska series, that I can recall. Even one from Pale Kings that might even compete with the Battle of Helm's Deep. But this one is definitely up there. Helm's Deep is so well written, so well realized. The battle is excellent in this book. I loved it. And it again makes me feel so disappointed as to why the Battle of Five Armies was not really written at all in The Hobbit. But if you want to hear me rant about why I didn't like the end battle in The Hobbit, then go check out episode 3 where I talk about The Hobbit. But yeah, The Two Towers, one of my favorite fantasy books of all time right now. The Two Towers and Return of the King are right now up there. I don't know where they rank. Maybe someday I'll rank all of the fantasy books that I've read. But right now, I don't know. I just know it's up there near the top. All right, with that said, my name is Cameron Michaels. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of Folktales and Fantasy. If you guys have any suggestions for something for me to talk about, a topic, a book, a sci-fi book, an anime, an adaptation, whatever, email me at folktalespod@gmail.com. folktalespod@gmail.com. Or if you don't want to email me, if you think emailing is out of style, then feel free to follow and DM me on Instagram. I have an Instagram, Cameron IG Michaels, and feel free to follow, and if you want, and just message me on there and say, hey, can you check out this book, or talk about this topic, talk about magic systems, or talk about theming again, or whatever. Anything, just let me know. And thank you guys so much for listening, and I will catch you guys next time.